So we know what a monopoly graph looks like. We've got the downward sloping demand curve, the marginal revenue curve that lies beneath it, because at every level of output, price is greater than marginal revenue. And then the marginal cost curve, profit maximized where marginal revenue equals marginal cost. There's Q star followed up to the demand curve. That's the price they're going to pay. So in a monopoly, the output is Q star, P star, that blue. And then the red is, what if this market were not monopolized? What if it were competitive? What if it were driven to the allocatively efficient level of output, like happens in competitive markets? In competitive markets, the allocatively efficient level of output happens at equilibrium. The market finds its way to the point where all the units that are worth more, willingness to pay, than they cost to make are made. All the units with willingness to pay greater than marginal cost, those units from Q star to QAE, they would be made. So in a competitive market, output would happen to where what people are willing to pay is exactly equal to what it costs to make, and price would be driven down then. If all that output were produced, price would be driven down to PC. So the monopolist keeps output lower in order to keep price higher than would prevail in a competitive market. And there's a few negatives from that. There's a few issues with that, right? So you can see, and I think looking at the labeled areas makes it easiest to see. If the market were perfectly competitive, price would be PC, we'd be selling QAE units. Consumer surplus would be A plus B plus C. Once the market is monopolized, well, let's just talk about what producer surplus would be. Producer surplus would be the area below price and above marginal cost, so producer surplus would be E plus D. Once the market is monopolized, output is lower and price is higher. These units from Q star to QAE, they're not produced anymore. So consumers aren't getting that surplus. You only get surplus on the units that you're consuming, and they're paying a higher price, so they're consuming less at a higher price. The new consumer surplus is just area A. And what about producer surplus? They have picked up area B, so they still have area E. They picked up area B, and so their producer surplus are selling at a price of P star out to Q star units. And so that's their new producer surplus. So how did things change? Change in surplus. For consumers had, let's move that over, change. Remember, big triangle means change. Consumers had A, B, and C. They lost B and lost C. What happened? Did that all go to producers? No, producers had E and D, now they have E and B, so they picked up B, but they lost D. So this is one issue people have with monopolies, is this area B is a transfer of surplus from consumers to producers. I'm not going to spell that out. And that could be thought of as an equity issue. I mean, it's not necessarily. We don't know who the consumers are for this good and who the monopoly producer is, but often consumers are small market participants. They don't have a lot of market power, and so a monopoly is often a larger firm that can wield a lot of market power, and so they're taking advantage of their market power and extracting more of this consumer surplus to the detriment of the consumers in society. So a whole bunch of people are being hurt by the higher price so that the monopoly gets higher producer surplus. Again, you can't necessarily, is that fair? Fair is a normative word. So we can't say it's a definite equity problem. It just depends on who the monopolist is, who the consumers are. But in a lot of cases, we would say this transfer of surplus from all these consumers to this one big monopolist is an equity concern in a lot of cases. So B, but at least B is surplus that still exists. Those gains are being made, they're just being made by the monopolist instead of the consumer. the area C and area D, consumers lost C, producers lost D, and they didn't go anywhere. Those are deadweight loss. That is the potential surplus, those potential gains from trade that aren't realized because these units that are worth more than they cost to make from Q star to QAE, those units aren't getting made. And so that surplus just disappears. And you kind of think like, well, why would a monopolist do something that decreases their surplus? Part of that deadweight loss is stuff the producer is losing. Why would they cut back output when they were getting surplus on it? But you can see, yeah, they lost that little area D, but they picked up B, which was more than worth it. By keeping output lower, they can keep price high enough that the gain from charging that higher price and extracting all of that area B from consumer surplus more than makes up for the small surplus they're losing on those units that aren't being produced. The consumers, on the other hand, have the worst of both worlds. They lose that surplus for those units not being produced, and they lose that big chunk area B because output is lower and price is higher. And that's what happens when markets are monopolized. Output tends to be lower and prices tend to be higher than you see in a competitive market. And so you don't get the allocatively efficient level of output. Let me write this over here. Shorthand. So problems, 1, not allocatively efficient. I'll just abbreviate it. You don't get the allocatively efficient level of output. You end up with deadweight loss. There is surplus that's going unrealized. It's not efficient. There are potential gains for both people, and they're not happening. These units are worth more when they're turned into this good than those resources are worth in their next best use. And the resources should be used here, and they're not. And also, transfer of surplus, consumer surplus to producer surplus, could be an equity issue. Could well be an equity issue. And another concern when we think about monopoly markets, they're not allocatively efficient. But remember, perfectly competitive markets were efficient in 2 different ways. The one we talked most about was that they're allocatively efficient, that they just go to equilibrium, and at that equilibrium, all the units that are worth more than they cost to make are getting made. All potential surplus is being realized. That's efficient. Monopolies don't do that. We know that. But remember, the other kind of efficiency with perfect competition was what we call productive efficiency. And monopolies aren't that either. Do you remember what that means? Not productively, I'm running out of space, efficient. I'm going to erase this picture now, but it's okay. You have it on video. Just to show. What we mean by that is, remember, perfectly competitive firms were driven to produce at minimum average cost. If they weren't producing at minimum average cost, somebody else would. They would drive the price down, and the firms that weren't producing at minimum average cost would be making a negative economic profit. So everyone in the industry had to produce at minimum average cost. That's where long-run equilibrium was. But for a monopolist, that's not true. So they produce where marginal revenue equals marginal cost, and they can make a profit. To show them making a profit at Q star, average cost is below price, so looking something like that. Again, average cost always hits its minimum where it's intersected by marginal cost. And so here they are. Profit is the difference between price and average cost out over all those units. They're maximizing their profit not where average cost is minimized. So they're not producing at minimum average cost because they don't have to, right? There's no pressure on them to be as efficient as possible because no one's making them. And you might think, well, why wouldn't they want to produce at minimum average cost, right? If they can make it cheaper, why don't they want to make it cheaper? And the answer is because anything past Q star adds more to that's marginal cost. Somebody was thinking that in their head. She made a mistake. Anything past Q star adds more to their cost than it adds to their revenue. It's not worth it. Yeah, they could produce a little bit more cheaply on average, but what they would lose they would lose profit because their costs would still go up by more than their revenue goes up, and it wouldn't be worth it to them to produce. Just like the allocatedly efficient, they'll give up some of that deadweight loss because their profit's higher if they restrict their output. They'll give up some of that productive efficiency because their profit's higher if they restrict their output. So they're making a profit. And the other big difference, as we talked about at length, the one big difference between monopoly or firms with market power and perfect competition is that they have this downward sloping demand curve. The other big difference is that this profit can last in long run as long as they have barriers to entry. So you've got this firm, they're producing inefficiently, not allocatedly efficiently, not productively efficiently. They're taking this consumer surplus and turning it into monopoly profit, which they can sustain period after period after period as long as they can sustain those barriers to entry. And so that's why we like competitive markets. That's why we encourage competitive behavior. We have laws like the Sherman Antitrust Act that says any monopolization or attempt to monopolize an industry is illegal. We have laws that against anti-competitive practices, because we know in competitive markets, if you leave them alone, you get all the units that are worth more than they cost to make being made. You get production at minimum average cost without anyone telling the market what to do. Just producers and consumers behaving in their own self-interest, you get there. When a market is monopolized, those things don't happen, and there is this transfer of surplus. And that's why we try to enact policies that encourage more competitive markets rather than less competitive, more monopolistic, high concentration of market power markets.